The SSN AUKUS submarine, a nuclear-powered submarine, features a British design, American weapons, and is being built in Australia. It will cost around $250 billion and is planned for deployment in the Pacific Ocean, where the West and China are competing for influence. But one Western country was very upset about the AUKUS deal: France. France lost a major $66 billion contract with Australia to sell 12 diesel submarines, which was cancelled in favor of the new UK-US submarine. France reacted strongly. It pulled its ambassador from Australia and nearly halted a trade deal between the two sides. French President Macron even publicly accused the Australian Prime Minister of lying.
Do you think he lied to you?
I don't think. I know.
Still, neither Australia, the US, nor the UK backed down. Australia was happy to join the small group of countries that have nuclear submarines. The US saw big geopolitical and financial benefits, especially for American and British companies, even if France lost out. This deal shows how the relationship between the US and its European allies is not always united. It seems they only act together when their interests match. To understand this better, we need to go back in time. The US-Europe relationship began in the early 1600s when the first English colony was founded in Jamestown, Virginia. European farmers found a treasure, not gold, but tobacco. Over the next 2 centuries, white Europeans spread across the new continent using enslaved Africans to build what became America. Things stayed like this until the American Declaration of Independence from Great Britain, which marked a new chapter. Although Europe maintained its influence, America was now independent, and that European dominance was beginning to fade. In the 20th century, World War I hit Europe hard. At first, the United States remained neutral, but it was eventually forced to enter the war after German attacks on its warships. The war ended with an Allied victory, but Washington emerged as the true winner, unlike the European powers, which were severely drained both economically and militarily. Then came World War II. Again, the U.S. stayed neutral until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The U.S. responded with full force, ending the war with atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war made the U.S. a global leader. At the same time, Europe was split into 2 sides by what Churchill called an Iron Curtain, an Eastern Bloc dominated by the Soviets and a Western Bloc aligned with the United States. The United States had the upper hand in this alliance, both financially and militarily. Financially, through the Marshall Plan, a project to rebuild war-torn Europe using American funds, and militarily, through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. In the 1950s, Europe accepted U.S. leadership out of fear of the Soviets. During the Korean War, the U.S. put nuclear weapons in Europe, turning it into a big American base. In the 1960s, Europe started to recover economically. France's President de Gaulle wanted Europe to be more independent. He wanted nuclear weapons for Europe and demanded equal power in NATO. When the U.S. said no, France left NATO's military command. But de Gaulle's independence-driven venture quickly lost momentum with the rise of the Christian Democrats to power in West Germany, and their move toward closer ties with the East, a shift that revived Europe's fears of communist expansion. Economically, the Nixon shock, which severed the link between the dollar and gold, triggered a major recession in Europe and led to a sharp decline in trust toward the United States, which had dealt a heavy blow to European currencies without hesitation. Militarily and politically, the United States became deeply involved in the Vietnam War and in Nixon and Kissinger's initiative to build closer ties with China. Then came a series of events: the October War and the resulting oil shock, which hit Europe hard. And although relations were relatively calm during the 1980s, some of President Reagan's initiatives, such as the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars, the bombing of Libya, sparked quiet tensions among NATO allies. Nevertheless, the alliance remained intact and even thrived, largely because the communist threat that had originally brought it together still existed. But things were on the verge of major change. The fall of the Berlin Wall, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the official end of the Cold War, marked a turning point. The United States began dismantling some of its military bases in Europe and supported the unification of Germany as a counterbalance to a defiant France. In response, the new Europe began trying to rely more on itself, establishing the European Union, adopting the euro as a single currency, and launching the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, as a partial alternative to NATO. Still, the Atlantic Alliance remained calm and resilient. The events of September 11 sparked what became known in the media as the War on Terror. Europe joined the U.S. in its invasion of Afghanistan, which became NATO's first operation outside the Atlantic region. However, when President Bush decided to expand the war by invading Iraq, most European allies, except Britain, rejected the move. In response, the U.S. harshly criticized France and Germany, labeling them as part of Old Europe. Transatlantic relations improved somewhat during President Obama's first term, as the U.S. scaled back the war on terror and withdrew from Iraq. However, that period was not without its troubles. Most notably, America's strategic shift toward Asia, which Europe saw as a sign of being sidelined. This concern deepened when Washington withdrew more than 10,000 troops from Europe during Obama's second term. Then came Trump, the man who championed the slogan, "America First."
I said, if you're not going to pay your bills, we're not going to defend you. And it also went for the attack. But if they got attacked, they said, well, does that mean you won't defend us? I said, are you current or are you delinquent? They said, if we were delinquent, would you? I said, nope, I would not.
And brought the country back to a spirit of isolationism reminiscent of the 1920s. He had no hesitation in criticizing the very alliance his country had helped create 7 decades earlier. Trump showed a level of disdain for the partnership with Europe unlike any other U.S. president in history, accusing Europeans of relying on American protection and demanding they pay for it. He singled out Germany, the EU's most powerful country, claiming it had built thriving cities and a strong economy thanks to U.S. military support. More importantly, Trump's actions matched his words. He withdrew 12,000 American troops from Germany, leaving Europe with the lowest number of U.S. forces since World War II. Despite Biden administration's efforts to repair the damage caused during Trump's presidency, European doubts have not disappeared. It's true that the United States has sent thousands of troops to Europe since the start of the Russian war on Ukraine, and provided tens of billions of dollars in military aid. But these steps haven't been enough to fully rebuild trust. The war in Ukraine gave NATO a renewed sense of purpose and a clear reason to continue. But it didn't silence Europe's long-standing questions. How long can Washington be relied upon? And what if Trump returns to the White House at the end of the year? But once Trump returned to the White House, relations between Washington and its European allies entered a new phase of tension. He once again repeated his earlier positions on NATO, calling it a costly burden, and this time hinted at a broader withdrawal of U.S. forces from Eastern Europe, right in the midst of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Trump's decision sent shockwaves through European capitals, especially Berlin and Warsaw, where the potential absence of American military support was seen as a strategic vacuum that Moscow might exploit to expand its influence. And as the U.S. froze some military aid to Ukraine, voices across Europe grew louder, calling for the creation of a unified European army, more seriously than ever before. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the Trump administration adopted a visibly pro-Israel stance, offering full support for Israeli military operations without conditions. This led to sharp disagreements with several European nations, which called for restraint and an immediate ceasefire. The rift widened when Trump refused to back any international investigation into human rights violations, leaving Europe feeling sidelined and powerless to influence its closest ally. In response to these developments, a new awareness began to take shape within Europe. Complete reliance on Washington was no longer a safe strategy. European security and political independence would now need to be built on new foundations, more realistic and less dependent on the White House. Thus, the transatlantic relationship no longer resembles the equal partnership it is often portrayed to be. It has become a strained and shifting alliance, reshaped under the pressure of wars and the unpredictable turns of U.S. politics. But as America turns inward and Europe faces growing threats from east and south, one question remains. Will Europe continue to follow America's lead or chart its own path forward?